Hey everyone, hope you're hanging in there. Today I want to talk about candidate fundraising. This is a really important consideration for your campaigns, as you already know, on the basis of the last 2 weeks of campaign strategy and management. It's really one of the most critical sources of campaign communication in today's campaigns, largely because, as we know, early money is such a massive piece of the puzzle when it comes to running a successful presidential, congressional, Senate, local campaign. I know that I mentioned earlier that successful congressional campaigns in the present moment, you're usually fundraising far in excess of $1 to $2 million. And so this is a really important consideration, especially, again, because of the fact that we have these sort of campaign-centered campaigns or candidate-centered campaigns in the present period. And so far outside of the regular role of parties, we have candidate funding becoming more and more important. And so the question we need to ask ourselves when we're designing these strategies is, how can we actually attract these resources to our campaigns? Obviously, we have the party that is going to be a sort of a welcome source of funding, as we saw in our sort of pre-FEC deadline filing demonstration. But we really want to think about how we might gain attention through endorsements, through volunteers, and through local media, all sort of with the ultimate objective of getting this money. And really what this leads us to, and something that I'm sure many of your groups are already sort of struggling through a little bit, is this idea that there's kind of a paradox that you have to spend money in order to make money. Many of the groups I saw already are buying party email lists or address lists with, for some of you, the express purpose of purchasing essentially access to people who are going to be more effectively targeted for fundraising. And so to attract resources, we often have to spend resources, which is one of the reasons why high-quality candidates often come to the table with a little bit of funding beforehand. So this early money can also signal, as we've seen in some of the recent campaign updates, can signal to observers both in the media and on the ground in terms of the local population whether or not a candidate is doing well, essentially. So polling, many weeks before the campaign, especially if it's tight, doesn't provide a very useful signal to people who are trying to make an evaluation as to whether or not they should support a candidate. However, this early money could be something that both influences media elites and also rank-and-file voters about whether or not they think that this campaign has merit, whether or not it's worth turning out for, it's worth participating in, maybe volunteering for. So another thing that is really kind of outside of this simulation is that it can also scare off challengers. So if you've raised a huge amount of money far in advance of the actual primary contest, it can actually deter some challengers from entering the race. And in fact, in many cases in the U.S., we'll see that at the congressional level, you actually have what's known as non-competitive races, where you'll have a Republican or a Democratic candidate who's been nominated and made it through the primary process, running unopposed with absolutely no one on the other side of the ballot. And you might be thinking to yourself, that seems crazy. That seems like a very unlikely possibility in a fully fledged democracy where you've got many people who are vying for power all the time. Turns out that that's not really the case. Even in today's politics, in a highly polarized and fragmented environment, you've got a lot of places where there's simply non-competitive elections. And so that's part of that is the disparities in incumbent fundraising relative to challengers. It's like this giant sort of first hurdle, and many challengers look at that hurdle and say, I don't really want to run the race. I have real doubts as to whether or not I'll be able to leap over that very first hurdle and cross the finish line. Lastly, I think one thing I just mentioned but want to talk about in a little bit more detail is that candidate fundraising can also get the attention of media. And it may be no surprise to you as you go through your campaign simulation that some of the candidates that have raised the most money in early weeks will turn out to be the candidates that are able to most effectively attract media attention. You probably saw in the first candidate update that a few groups attempted to have some sort of open requests for interviews or tried to hold an event. And most of the time, those events were pretty sparsely attended. Most of the time, only fringe media elements were willing to reach out to the campaigns. You saw that those mainstream media in the print and the television sources were not willing at this point to offer these candidates interviews. And part of the reason for that is that they're still trying to evaluate whether or not these candidates are serious. And so if we can raise a lot of money in the early stages, this is one of the ways that media sources will start to vet candidates and say, oh, this is somebody who we actually do want to talk to, because they're somebody who has a good chance of if not winning, at least competing in this election. And so fundraising matters for all sorts of the downstream actions that your candidates can take in 3-4 weeks from now. Now, when we think about financial flows, how people can actually go about donating to politics, one sort of dimension that we need to talk about that we probably don't have a lot of time in this course to cover is the sort of FEC guidelines and rules surrounding donations. Of course, we've already mentioned a little bit that some of these fundraising totals that are coming to you, we're sort of bracketing some of these considerations. Some of the groups have already received very large financial donations from single individuals. We're kind of going to pretend that those single individuals are kind of representative of entire swaths of industry or of a large set of potentially wealthy donors. There are strong limits, hard caps on direct individual donations to candidates. I think it's something like $2,800, $2,400 in the most recent FEC period. It's not something that really is where a lot of the money in politics is coming. Even the really wealthy rock crushing magnates or the Veterans Affairs coordinator person, all these people on your worksheet, they're unable to donate these large sums of money in real life to their candidates. Instead, they might be able to engage in connected PAC contributions. I'm sure many of you have already heard of super PACs. There are ways that we can funnel at least a little bit more money through political action committees that are set up in the candidate's name from these wealthy individuals to the campaigns. However, a lot of the spending that's happening in campaigns is outside spending. And so that means that we as the campaign communications coordinators, we don't have any direct, or at least we're not supposed to have any direct access to those funds, and we're not supposed to be able to have an influence on the way that those funds are spent. This is the difference between so-called campaign money and so-called outside money. So these soft money or connected groups we can think of as 501c4s. That's like the dark money where we can't actually trace who it was that made those donations. And then also 527 groups are what are again known as super PACs. And so again, in the simulation, we're dealing with campaign budgets which are again fairly realistic in terms of how much money we have to spend. But of course, we need to be cognizant of the fact that there's this whole other universe of money out there in many of these campaigns, especially competitive ones, that are going to be potentially putting out campaign communications without our consent, without our coordination, or at least supposedly without our coordination. And so that's going to be a really important element to think about in the future, whether or not some of these disconnected groups, the 501c4s and 527s, decide that they want to spend money in our districts as well. So stay tuned for some of those considerations. Of course, again, I put on the slide here super PACs. That's kind of what we're talking about here. But given that we're living in this environment where we've got a lot of money being spent, money flying around outside of our campaigns, and additionally we're attempting to make our own campaign advertisements and spend money to distribute information to citizens, right? We need to think about persuasion more generally, how we're going to create those advertisements, how we're going to create those communications to be as persuasive as possible in terms of both making money and making sure our money goes to good use. So we know, for example, that this kind of fundraising stuff, right? It's a little bit of a conflict. If you think about it, there's a tension here that exists. This is one thing that I'm going to try to sort of tease out a little bit in the simulation in the next few weeks, so be prepared for it. Getting money from wealthy donors, having super PACs spending a lot of money in disconnected spending in your districts, this is something that could actually result in a more cynical public, a public that's actually maybe upset about the way that your campaign is being run. And so, when you're doing this fundraising, you have to be thoughtful about the fact that some of your messages to potential fundraisers could be a little bit different than the messages that you want to get out to the public. And so you want to be as sort of, tread as lightly as possible in doing this fundraising, so as not to raise any eyebrows in the public. We know, for example, that, of course, many of you have already caught on to this and have been talking about it very seriously in your group discussions, that the 99% are sort of rank and file voters in the districts. Fundraising from them might represent a way to sort of avoid some of these critiques. So this, I think, presents, again, a whole new realm, a whole new dimension of campaign communication, and something also that your groups want to pay attention to. For those of you who are maybe behind in fundraising, and you're looking across the way at your opponents and seeing who they raised money from, remember, you can use these fundraising targets as potential critiques. So, if the rock crusher guy or, some of these other people donate money to the candidate. For example, I remember one of the groups got campaign funding from this sort of crazy, like, birther guy, right? The sort of far right ideologue. You can use that, right? Say that this person has donated money directly to the campaign. That could become a pretty, useful source of political attack ads. So again, depending on where you get the money from, how you pitch that message of whether or not you're running more of a populist campaign or more of a campaign that doesn't care about those considerations, this could open you up to attacks. It could also strengthen your position. So, we need to think carefully about both fundraising messages and messages to the public about other candidates' fundraising. For example, how do we choose a medium in terms of reaching voters on that dimension? What kind of themes, right? What thematic elements are most effective in persuading people about giving money and also being upset about other campaigns getting money? What kind of policies are important to mention? I know many of you have already thought about these appeals and how you might tailor the appeals to some of the groups that are willing to fundraise you. But also other things, right? Some of the same technique questions that we encountered earlier in the semester when we were making our campaign ads. Right? Some of those techniques might be very different when we're making a specific targeted fundraising appeal. So all of these things are things to think about in your campaigns as you move closer. So the last thing I want to mention is that there are a huge variety of different kinds of asks that you can do. Obviously, some of those are on the worksheet, but again, use your imaginations. Be creative when you're creating these fundraising appeals, and think about other ways that you might be able to ask for money, because as we've seen over the last 2 weeks, it seems pretty clear that you're going to want to continue to do this as much as possible throughout the first half of the campaign in ways that will allow you to gain that fundraising advantage, signal to the media that you're a credible candidate, and also have money to be able to run some of these ads, increase candidate visibility, name recognition, and also start to steer the topics of debate. So we'll see in the Excelsior University polls that keep getting published throughout the weeks, we'll start to get some district-based opinions about the campaign itself. So we'll start to see what are some of the issues that the public starts to see as being most important, and how we might be able to influence those things by putting out communications. So these communications, the type of ask communications, right, these could all be really useful in driving the potential success of that strategy as a result of fundraising. So again, these are all a huge variety of considerations. It's a very complicated picture, and it's something that I'm hoping that you all really entertain seriously in your discussions in the next couple weeks as we continue to work on our campaigns and get closer and closer to Election Day. So with that, I will leave you to prepare for the midterm, which is coming up next week. Feel free to ask questions during office hours. Feel free to ask questions via email, and I'll be very happy to provide you with some of that content. So long, and have a wonderful week.